Good evening and welcome to CogX. We're on the Economy and the Future of Work stage here, and it is our last event of this evening. And I think that we're ending with a bit of a cracker. The event that's coming up is Testing Our Defences, the Global Disinformation Pandemic, where we'll be discussing the other pandemic, that of fake news. And I'm going to hand over now to Laura Wardle from the BBC in order to introduce the event.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session at CogX 2020 online. It is the last session of the day, so I hope you've all got a glass of wine or a G&T in hand as we head into this. Testing our defences, the global disinformation pandemic. I'm Laura Ellis from the BBC, and I have with me three world-class guests as we spend the next 45 minutes exploring disinformation, AI and COVID-19. Now, we're going to edit this session into a podcast, so just before I introduce them properly and get underway, I hope you'll indulge me if I do a very quick podcast version of this. Here we go. Hello, I'm Laura Ellis. Welcome to the Media, Tech and Society podcast from BBC Design and Engineering, a place where we explore technology, rhetoric and reality. Today, testing our defences, the global disinformation pandemic. COVID-19 has tested our defences against disinformation in an unprecedented way. From conspiracy theories about 5G to dangerous claims around cures, the battle's been fought on multiple fronts. So who are the villains, and has AI been a hero? To dig deep into all of this, we've brought together an expert panel here at CogX 2020. We have Renée DiResta from the Stanford Internet Observatory in California, Claire Wardle, who leads strategy at First Draft, which is a non-profit to tackle disinformation globally, and Camille, the Chief Innovation Officer at Graphika, and she there leads the company's work on disinformation and harassment. Welcome all. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's really, really good to see you. I want to start by saying that it's been quite a few months for those of us interested in disinformation, hasn't it? Or a few weeks, few months, I guess. And I'd like to start with a reflection, if that's okay, from each of you about what we've learned from COVID. Let's start with you, Renée. I've read something that you said last week, which was that this is an opportunity to see how the whole world pays attention to a topic. COVID's got our attention. What have we learned?
It's a great question. So one of the things that we're looking at is an understanding of how various types of actors, so state actors, domestic conspiracy theorists, people who have products to sell, honestly, also a lot of spam, a lot of people selling fake cures, how they each are treating this particular topic and the battle for attention. So we've been looking a lot at how each of these different entities can use the information environment to their advantage, whether that's state media pushing out the kind of public diplomacy state narrative that they want the public to believe, or a person who wants to sell you colloidal silver to cure it. So we've been examining how narratives are bouncing back and forth between different communities and how they gain traction as they spread.
Fascinating stuff. It really is a banquet, isn't it, for people who like to be active in this space. Claire, let's come to you. You've often spoken about the different types of dis and misinformation that we see. Have we seen any new trends emerging in your view?
So the one thing I've seen in the last few months monitoring is that the kind of conspiracy space, which obviously has been with us for a number of years, but we would see that on the fringes. I think the most worrying aspect of the last few months is seeing those kind of spaces move quite firmly into mainstream spaces. So all of a sudden you have your high school friends, your auntie, your mum sharing the kind of content that you wouldn't normally see being shared. And I think that's partly because we have to understand the specific moment we're in, where people have had their lives turned upside down and looking for answers. And actually with COVID, we don't have a clear origin story. We don't have a clear treatment yet. And yet people need something to hang on to. And so unfortunately, conspiracies are feeding that need. And so that for me has been the big standout trend of the last couple of months.
Thank you. And Camille, you do a lot of work on seeing where these conversations are coming from and who's getting involved and what's being said. Something that I get asked all the time is, by Claire, as you say, those friends and family, people are offering me advice. They're saying, drink water. They're saying, take this or try this. And that sounds like really sensible advice. Why wouldn't I want to listen to it? So why are people giving what appears to be sort of quite nice advice, as if they're doctors and pretending to be doctors in some cases? What's going on with that?
Yeah, that's a fun and difficult question. There's a lot that's going on really in that space, and I think it points to what both Renée and Claire were saying. We should really unpack the different types of activity. On the one hand, you have misinformation, and so people who are sharing information that is inaccurate, but not with an intent to deceive you, perhaps just with an intent to care for you or to expose you to an information they think is right. And then on the other hand, you have disinformation. And so people who are intending to deceive you in sharing bad information with the intention to trick you and to really, to share this bad information. And so I think this first distinction is helpful. Now, the types of players who are sharing mis and disinformation is a very crowded field, right? You have trolls, of course. You have bad actors who are pretending to be other people. You have coordinated campaigns, and then you have the occasional viral misinformation that is just being spread very quickly and very far, for a bad combination of factor, but without anyone being a bad actor in it.
We've seen some interesting interventions in the last few months. I noticed that in the very early days, we saw that Facebook were pulling down a veil over a particular story, and then I didn't see that again. And more recently, there have been some other interventions, not only in this field but also in the wider disinformation field. Can we talk about that a little bit? Renée, what is it that what effect does it have when we see that kind of intervention from the social media platforms? Does it work?
Well, the platforms have three options, right? So the Facebook's term for the policy is remove, reduce, inform. Remove means they take it down entirely. So usually that's it's precipitating some sort of immediate harm is usually when they're going to use that one. Reduce is they reduce its distribution in the newsfeed. Twitter, you hear that called shadow banning sometimes, or downranking, or what they're doing is they're basically using tools to say this still exists on the platform, but it is not going to receive quite as widespread distribution. The algorithms aren't going to help it along. And then the last is inform, which is the kind of interstitial overlay that you're talking about that provides some context for the information right adjacent to the information. And so with the case of something like, let's use the pandemic video, which I'm not sure if your audience, it did make it to the UK. I was a misinformation video that elevated a series of false claims, and the platforms had to decide how to respond to it. The problem with taking something down is oftentimes it's already gone viral by the time they're considering the removal process. And so there's usually a second wave of complaints about censorship at that point. So you have to deal with the misinformation first, then you deal with the allegations that the platform is censoring. So that creates kind of two mini news cycles or hype cycles around that one piece of content. With Inform, the challenge is you have to have the fact check done and ready, or you have to have the alternative information to point to the correction in order to make that overlay compelling. And that takes time. And so some of the work that we've done at Stanford recently is trying to explain that time differential. It takes 2 days for a good fact check or kind of counter narrative to be to kind of address the misinformation specifically to be ready to go. And so the question for the platforms is really, how long do you allow harmful information to stay up while that process is taking shape? And how do we think about which of the sort of three buckets of interventions to use for any particular type of misinformation or disinformation?
I saw a really interesting quote from somebody who used to work on at YouTube, and you mentioned the word algorithm. And I've spent a lot of time during this crisis trying to work out, whether AI is being helpful or not in helping us to tackle this whole issue. I guess that we all know that when we get stuff delivered to us via, for example, a YouTube feed, that's happening because an algorithm is looking at our preferences. Equally, the sort of thing that you've just talked about in terms of how we track down this information is being, we're having help from machine learning, from algorithms with that. Claire, how do you feel that that ML has helped us in this crisis? Has it done anything that you think is particularly good, or is it exacerbating the problem? Where are we?
So as an academic by training, it won't surprise you when I say this is really complex. And the thing about speech is that speech is really complex. And so there's a lot of different ways that AI is playing a role right now. But a lot of the speech that we're talking about now as being problematic, and even using the term problematic, we wouldn't necessarily all agree what that is. So when we're trying to say, are the AI systems working in terms of identifying it and making decisions, a lot of the kind of content that we might spend a lot of time talking about as these edge cases are edge cases explicitly because as humans, we would struggle to know what to do with it. So the challenge here is, AI is very good around things like graphic imagery, that we could all as society agree with. It's not particularly good at the kind of content that we're talking about and we're discussing as society. So, in many ways, AI has had to step up right now because we've had to use more of it as content moderators were being moved home because of the pandemic. And so in that space, there's been an extra reliance on it. And I think there's been a lot of learning about what has worked and what hasn't, which is a good thing. My hope as a researcher is that we're looking at this as this natural experiment to really look at the data around kind of some of those questions of what can AI do, what can it achieve? But one of the challenges for people who are newer to this space is this idea of like, well, something's true or it's false, right? But actually, the more you spend time in these spaces, you realize that most of this stuff is really gray. And until we as a society can figure out what we want to do with that gray speech, it's very hard to train algorithms to do that kind of work. So I hope that we come out of this time with a real understanding of what's possible, and also understand that as AI gets smarter, we can take the lessons from today and say, well, we had to use it disproportionately for this moment, but what does this mean once AI gets smarter? And how do we also understand the unintended consequences of some of this, that maybe more speech has come down, and what do we feel about that? Because ultimately, my frustration with some of these conversations is the public are really absent in these conversations. People say the platforms should do more, but we really need as a society to figure out what do we want platforms to do. And it could be that in Europe, there's a very different sense about speech than there is in the US or there is in, Saudi Arabia. And so again, this is really, really complex. So when we say, is AI working on this kind of speech? There's a million different ways of unpacking just that question.
And you're absolutely right. It's so difficult because we've all got an investment in wanting to know the truth about this because we're all doing this lockdown thing and we're all trying not to catch it and we're all trying to keep our friends and our families safe. So we all have a real investment. And the point that you made about there being grains of truth is a really interesting one. Camille, can we reflect on that? To what extent is it more difficult if there are things that the bad actors can hang their disinformation on, which might be things that we want to believe, or perhaps even things that are correct and that they can sort of build a disinformation miasma around. Are you seeing that in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's always the case. I think that's the most important and an interesting part when you look at foreign actors or other types of disinformation actors trying to manipulate the information environment is they always start with something that already exists in the information environment, and then they manipulate it and then they amplify it. I think in many ways that goes back to your question on the role of AI in the feature as a feature of that space, right? On AI creating chaos in the information environment, you have at least two different ways in which it's doing that. The first one is the amplification part, how much of the content that people are consuming is being amplified by algorithms that sometimes can contribute to enhancing the problem, enhancing that content. The other part in which we see AI and advances in AI contribute to the disinformation problem is, of course, in creating that content, and specifically in the creation of synthetic content. There was a lot of discussion around deep fakes, of course, but I think for me, more top of mind are synthetic images and synthetic text. And so classifiers, for instance, around creating fake profile pictures from scratch, pictures that never existed using generative adversarial networks, or creating text that were never written by an author, but that are believable and engaging using technology like GPT-2 or the GPT-3 that was released a week ago. I really agree with what Claire said on the struggles that we have and how to properly use machine learning in a more defensive capacity, notably because here natural language processing isn't able to be as subtle as we would want, and honestly relying too heavily on automated classifiers and on machine learning processes to do the role of detection and moderation creates huge biases and problems at scale that we're now pretty well documented and that we're aware of. So, thinking about how AI interplays with information is always this question of, okay, how is it part of the problem, and what other problems do we need to consider before making it part of the solution, if that makes sense?
Yes, like you, I've been looking for the deep fakes. I've been looking to see what are the key new problematic pieces of synthetic content, and not seen very many. So let's just stay with you for a second, Camille. What's the worst or most surprising piece of content you've seen with regards to COVID so far?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think we were quite surprised by the trend that we observed very early on of homebrew trackers and homemade medicine. And I think the reason why it surprised us is because it was very clear in the information environment. It's people sort of expressing a distrust in institution, a distrust in the medical establishment, and saying, no, I'm going to count the COVID curve myself, and I'm going to do my own modeling. And that caught on fairly quickly. And we saw that trend happen in every market and audiences that we looked at. So I would say that's the most surprising one, because it was extraordinarily clear.
Yeah. Same question to you, Claire.
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I think for me, because we spend a lot of time tracking how disinformation moves to the news media, and I think the moment that I really recognized that we had problems was when the kind of fringe 5G conspiracy space suddenly catapulted out of a pretty fringe space through Woody Harrelson talking about it, and a couple of UK celebrities, Amanda Holden and Amir Khan, and all of a sudden it went from 0 to 60. And in that time, you saw the media really struggling with this. Do we talk about it? Do we do it? Do we give it credibility? But you actually had in the UK, we had phone masts being burnt down. We had telecoms engineers being spat at. I mean, it was all of a sudden went from, online disinformation that seemed pretty fringy to real world harm. And that for me kind of took me by surprise, and lots of conversations with newsrooms about their role at a moment like that. And most newsrooms are not trained in how to effectively report on disinformation in a way that doesn't do more harm by necessarily giving it legitimacy or just giving it oxygen. And so I think in this moment, there's been many examples, but the 5G one will be a case study that I will talk about for years to come, I think.
The 5G one, I thought it was so fascinating, because 5G, it almost felt like an argument waiting to have a platform. And suddenly coronavirus was the argument that the 5G conspiracy theorists really wanted to say, here's something we can go and, actually do something about. Renée, what about you? What out of what we've seen surprised or horrified you the most?
Well, I've studied conspiracy theories for about 5 years now, and I actually got my start in researching how narratives spread by looking specifically at the American anti-vaccine movement. As an activist on the other side, actually, as a pro-vaccine parent who wanted to work on countering those narratives and to try to understand how they were taking hold on social media. So a lot of the early work I did before I was at Stanford was very much from the point of view of how do we think about countering these narratives? How do we think about the way these communities grow? How do we think about the way the algorithm inadvertently amplifies them? And so this is not, unfortunately, very new. I've seen all of these conspiracies before. They popped up with Zika, they pop up with Ebola, they pop up anytime there's an epidemic. What's really unique about COVID is that they popped up everywhere simultaneously. So the kind of activity that you normally see when there's an outbreak in a particular country, like measles in Samoa or in Brooklyn, US, New York last year, that's where you had kind of pockets of this information beginning to come out. Many of the anti-vaccine activists are also anti-5G activists. There's a lot to understand about the relationship in distrust of government and distrust of scientists, and willingness to accept sort of unproven pseudoscience that goes very much back to not even the information environment, but just the proclivities of the people and the leadership. And so it's been interesting to me to see ways in which these relationships that we've seen develop over a period of years In the US, many of our reopen protests were coordinated by anti-vaccine activists who had previously coordinated anti-vaccine protests. So the interesting thing for us, and the reason we did the comprehensive study of the pandemic video, was trying to understand what it was about that particular piece of content that made it so appealing to the mainstream, both in terms of its distribution. And there were a few things that, we've written this up, and I don't want to take too long on it, but in addition to the very slick production value and the fact that it was much more appealing than just spouting off a litany of pseudoscience jargon, which most people kind of turn off. They think it's a little too tinfoil hatty. This was really produced for a mainstream audience, and it was immediately produced with the narrative that the social platforms will take this down. So you need to be a part and fight against censorship. And that was what really got it spread, actually. It was not so much people believing the discredited researcher who was the subject of the video. It was the call to action that they be part of ensuring that the truth be made available to the American public. And that attracted a very different set of activists than we normally see in the pseudoscience community kind of, web. So I think that was, for us, one of the more interesting pieces of misinformation we've seen here, in part because it was so very predictable. It was so that build up to it was actually quite slow. It happened over a period of about 2 weeks. And it really got us thinking a lot more about how do we think about the intervention side of this? How do we think a little bit more about what to do with these signals and how to respond to conspiracies in ways more sophisticated than simply taking them down?
It's such an interesting point, and I haven't thought much about it. I have seen a lot of stuff on my feeds and other people's feeds that I've been looking at around that call to action. We often hear it in the UK. I guess it's probably the same in the US. Mainstream media won't tell you this, or they won't report on this. You have to, and it's almost kind of obliging you as a citizen to do that. I also think it's really fascinating. And you've touched on this, and we're going to start to look at some solutions now. And we've got a question. But the whole right-left issue of this is the thing that's completely knocked me backwards. The whole fact that in America in particular, you're seeing the Trump supporters, picking this up as a narrative and saying, reopen, not wearing masks, going to bars and all that kind of stuff. We haven't had quite the same sort of reaction in the UK, maybe a bit. But I just think that's been a really interesting factor. So let's go to our first question. So Joe has asked, what can democratic states do to combat disinformation from malevolent states and actors? Claire, let's start with you on that one.
Well, I was going to say, Camille and Renée do a lot more work in terms of kind of foreign disinformation campaigns. But I think ultimately the problem is that many of these actors are using the platforms as they have been designed to be used. And so the challenge here is, if we're going to say we're going to take particular actions on the content, that becomes very difficult as opposed to who they are, what their actions are. But as these actors have become smarter, I mean, in many ways, the platforms were wholly unready for this in 2016. But again, I go back to how do we as societies think about information operations? How do we even define that? How is that different from the way that activists for years have been using these platforms? And how can you be transparent as a platform without basically saying we understand what those tactics are and giving away that extra knowledge to these state actors? So I'll let Camille and Renée talk about it. But again, this is not an easy question to answer for a democratic society.
Camille.
Yeah, I would also start by a definition issue, right? I think there's a lot that gets grouped in foreign interference, and having a clear idea of what is it that you're talking about, and specifically making the difference between overt propaganda, right? Like what state-funded outlets are doing, what foreign spokesperson are saying on social media, versus covert campaign. And so when those foreign entities pretend to be local activists, when those foreign entities create media that don't exist and that are engaging with the public debate. So the first thing I would say is we need a very clear difference between covert campaigns and then the sort of the general public diplomacy that's happening. For covert campaign, I do believe that exposing them and then creating clear rules and standards around what governments should and shouldn't do on social media is important. And that's something on which we still have miles to go. I think in a in many ways, that's a conversation that started in 2016 with the US waking up to the Russian manipulation of their social media environment around the election. And so we're sort of catching up very quickly, but there's still a lot that we need to do on this front.
Renée, let's pick that up with just some thoughts about where we are, particularly now with Facebook and the state-based media advertising issue. Where do you stand on that, and what should we be doing? I've heard an awful lot of criticism this week of Mark Zuckerberg, particularly when you compare Facebook's approach to this with what's recently happened on Twitter, which I know is very different. And Twitter are talking to a kind of a slightly different audience. What do you make of all that in the context of this state player argument?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of labeling state media. I think that people have a right to know where their information comes from. I think they have a right to know who's paying for it. I think Russia in particular, with Ruptly and all of the subsidiaries for RT that do not disclose, that do not have Russia in the name, people don't know what it is that they're sharing. I think it is very, very important to have those labels attached. And I think that is actually under US law, we have a law called FARA, a Foreign Agent Registration Act, where recognizing that in the interest of preserving the American commitment to free speech and free expression, we allow these media properties to operate, to communicate in our media environment and with our citizens, so that people can be exposed to these ideas. But at the same time, people can also know when a media property is an apparatus of the state and has a particular agenda. And so I think that the labeling piece of that was something that we've advocated for. Alex Stamos and Vanessa Moulter and myself wrote a piece in Washington Post about this specifically in the context of China. As we began to see Chinese state media, keep in mind Facebook is banned in China, Chinese state media has amassed pages with 99 million followers, probably 7 or 8 of them at this point. They run ads using these pages. If you do not know that it is Chinese state media, what they're doing is they're using paid pushes to push a Chinese state position to audiences worldwide without disclosing that it is in fact the Chinese state position. And these people have never solicited contact with this publication. They haven't gone out looking for this. Instead, because of the mechanics of online advertising, it's simply pushed to them. So we can debate whether or not the push should be allowed, whether or not the advertising itself should be allowed. But I think as far as the labeling, the much, much clearer labeling, that absolutely has to happen. You see videos going viral on Twitter where if you watch the video on YouTube, the state media label is appended to the bottom. But because of this loophole in user interface design, if you see the same video on Twitter, that label is missing. And so there are really a lot of things to do, I think, to make that transparency clearer to the people who are consuming and sharing this content. And I think China is a particularly interesting case because, again, their own citizens can't see this content. This is entirely intended for outside consumption.
Someone else who uses Twitter in a way that's quite extraordinary, clearly, is Donald Trump. What did you make, Renée, of the, some would say, sort of fairly late decision to mark up his content, it obviously enraging him, and to suggest that perhaps it may not be 100% wholly factual or truthful?
Well, look, I mean, a fact check is not a violation of free speech. I watched that play out. I thought it was remarkable. Of what censorship is in America has been extraordinary. It used to be if your content was taken down, if your content was actively, if people could not see your content. Appending a fact-checking label to a tweet is not censorship. It is not in any way a violation of freedom of expression or the president's right to free speech. What it is, per our conversation a little bit earlier about remove, reduce, inform, is it provides a way to do that inform function and to say, hey, there's disputed content here. Here's the alternative. Here's here's what the facts on the ground are, not the alternative facts, but the actual facts. Go and have a look at them and then make up your mind. So that's where I think there is, again, a need for more of the fact check labeling approach rather than the censorship or downranking approach, so that newsworthy content, particularly when the president of the United States is deliberately misspeaking or deliberately lying, I think is what we used to call that, the label is absolutely accurate.
Camille, what did you make of it? Was it, in your view, was it too little, too late, or was it a welcome intervention?
No, I think that's a very welcome intervention. And I also think that question that Renée is asking about the cross-platform effect here is really wise, because of course we have not seen Facebook adopt the same policy, and that content travels across platform. That is also true of the state media labeling, right? Because these platforms will not only implement it differently, but they will also define it differently. And so as we see those progress, I think it's the right moment for researchers and for independent parties to really call out the best practices and make sure that they're well circulated across the entire industry. Because I think the other thing that we're clearly seeing is each of the different platforms taking a quite different approach to these questions. Sometimes it's in subtle differences, like how do you define state media? And sometimes it's not at all subtle, like their positioning with regard to the president's post. We tend to, I think, often put all Silicon Valley in one basket. I think a very good 2020 lesson is that this isn't true. We do have very different takes here across the big companies.
Do you think Facebook will change? Do you think they'll change their position?
I think we can start a betting pool. I don't have the answer to that question.
It's an interesting one. I saw a great article from Ben Thompson. I think it's called the Stratechery, I can never say it, blog, saying that Twitter's a sideshow on this effectively, and that the battle should be being fought with and by Facebook. But I guess that's something we'll see over the next few weeks. I've got another question. So Claire, to you, disinformation trends. Do you foresee new and varied efforts to spread disinformation? We've got quite a few already, haven't we? But evolving out of the attempts by companies to fact check current ones.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this play out since 2016, which is as the platforms have become more aware of the challenges and have taken greater steps, then, essentially agents of disinformation have had to change their tactics. So, they're no longer able to buy ads in certain currencies. So of course, that has changed, et cetera, et cetera. So a couple of things, which is, understanding where the guidelines are and pushing out content that just hits those guidelines but doesn't cross it, which is why so much of this stuff has a kernel of truth to it, or it's genuine content from previously but used in a new context. So we're seeing that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, the other thing is, how can you infiltrate domestic groups and essentially push your agenda in that way? So you have people pushing your beliefs and the messages that you want to push, but it doesn't look like foreign interference, or it doesn't look like something that a platform should take a position on. So, certainly my worry is that as we move into 2020 election season, too many people are still playing by the rules of 2016 and haven't necessarily understood how those tactics have changed. And I think ultimately, as I said in my last answer, these platforms are being used in the way that they were designed to be used. And it's very, very difficult to say, well, we'll have certain rules here, but not over there, when ultimately, who is it that's pushing the message? Where does the red thread go back to? And real-time attribution is so difficult. I mean, there's a piece today in the New York Times about potential Chinese meddling, which may have credence, but there was a complete lack of evidence in that reporting. But everybody wants to jump to these conclusions because that's what we want to know in real time. And unfortunately, it often takes amazing work by people like Camille and Renée to say, this is the network, this is how it operated. But it's very rare that you have that in real time. So unfortunately, when people say, what are we going to see? We're just going to see more sophistication. And the question is, can we catch up? Can we act in the same time frame as those who are trying to push false and misleading information?
And just to be clear, when you say more sophistication, you don't just mean, moves into more complex deepfakes. It's about tactics. It's about how things appear. It's about the levels of dissimulation that we're going to see. Is it or is it both?
Yeah, because ultimately the platforms are on the lookout for deepfakes. I mean, you've got more people desperately waiting for that deepfake than you do have people understanding how really divisive content can be, like an old scrubby CCTV image or just an old meme that recirculates. That's the stuff that we spend all day monitoring. That's the stuff that really gets shared widely. I'm much less concerned about the big deep fake that everybody else is waiting for.
Yeah. There was a great line this week where somebody said, I can't remember who it was, but this is more about a business model than about a set of ethics. It's more about the fact that the business models that we currently work with are clearly always going to be disposed to pushing this stuff out there and to giving it more and more of a life with its audiences. So a follow-up question to that, just sticking with you, Claire. there's a company, says one of our audience, named FactMatter, that we know about, that scores online content for safety and credibility using criteria like political bias and hate speech. Is this something that we could see more of, and are these effective tools?
I'm just going to take this time to say it, which is, yes, we have to think about how technology can help automate processes right now that doing manually is very, very time consuming and often does take a real toll on the people that are doing that kind of work. But, and this is a very large but, I am really concerned that we're running too quickly to develop technology that with this sense of like, well, the machine can make those distinctions. And so I know there is a market now for this idea of like, we can automate these processes, but I think around certain types of speech, yes, where there is a clear understanding of what that speech looks like. And if I had 100 people in the room, 98% of them are probably going to agree, we're onto something there. My bigger concern is when we talk about hate speech or when we talk about certain forms of disinformation, or even conspiracies. I mean, one of the biggest tactics we see at First Draft, we do this monitoring, is an increasing use of satire. Because if you label something as satire, you can say, oh, I was only joking, didn't mean any harm. But by that stage, it circled the globe because everybody is just, they didn't realize it was satire and you've got a real problem. How do computers make sense of satire? How do we keep up with these tactics? Because yes, automation will help knock out some of this stuff, but a lot of the stuff that I see every day and really worry about, I struggle with my own team to make distinctions about what we should do about some of this stuff. Like, I want us to be much more sophisticated about the way we think about these types of speech before we really put this into the hands of AI systems, because this stuff is complex for humans, let alone for machines. I'll get off my soapbox.
Stay on that soapbox. It's particularly difficult with satire, isn't it? Because it has protected status. And I was having a conversation with somebody last week about automated tagging of content, and satire is really problematic because you can kill it off, and yet it can also be being used, as you say, to kind of infiltrate, without it necessarily having I was going to say a good purpose or being designed to entertain. It can be designed to harm as well, I guess.
But so this also goes back, to the label stuff, Laura. We just talked about state media. All the research about what kind of labels work, things like state media labels work and satire works. And it makes people feel uncomfortable. Like, well, if you have to put the label on, then it's not satirical. But unfortunately, in a newsfeed where everything looks the same, our brains are desperate for heuristics. We desperately need mental shortcuts to help us make sense of this information. And the platforms have stripped all those heuristics out. And surprise, surprise, we're all struggling. And so actually, we just have to think much more about these kind of labels and satire. We have the academic evidence that says we need that. Again, I promise I don't.
Let's spend a bit more time on labeling, actually, because that was one of the things I was going to come on to. Labeling is just, I know there's a lot of work going on this at the moment. It's so important, isn't it? Renée, do you have any thoughts about how we find ways to tell people what they're seeing without annoying them, making them feel stupid or disenfranchised, or doing that awful call to action about, right, well, if somebody's going to tell me this is wrong, I might even just share it more widely?
I think it's the simplicity, really. It's here's the place to click through. We've seen, I think there's been some early work on fact checking, particularly as Facebook was originally prioritizing fact checking back in 2017, early 2017. If you recall, before the full scope of the Russia interference operation in the US was known, a lot of the focus was on fake news, which had a different meaning before the president took that over. But and things that were actually demonstrably false, and what should the platforms do about fake news? And so they built this they built a collection of relationships with fact-checking entities. One of the challenges in the US is that fact-checking itself is politicized also, particularly because, unfortunately, what academic research has consistently shown is that disproportionate amounts of sort of conservative microblogs are more likely to put out false or misleading content, which leads to a debate, a concern that conservative properties are fact-checked more often than liberal properties. And, this has been a whole kind of ongoing morass in the US. But what they wound up trying to do was then develop diverse fact-checking partners. And I think that is actually a way to mitigate some of the allegations of, bad faith and partisanship in fact-checking itself. I think ultimately the platforms have to take a stand and do it, though, right? Which otherwise they're constantly falling under this this problematic environment in which working the refs and saying things like, no, it's anti-conservative bias to fact check. It's something that, they feel a need to respond to that as if that's a serious complaint, because they're afraid of being regulated by the party in power. So there's a lot of different layers to thinking about that. I think ultimately what we saw in the fact checks of the pandemic video was that they were in fact shared into many of the communities that had shared the video. Shared into the communities that had shared the video that were not what we can call the true believers, like the diehards, just the random local communities that had seen the pandemic video and shared it. When they were shared into those communities, they were engaged with in good faith. When the same fact check was shared into the diehard communities, the anti-vaccine communities, the anti-5G, et cetera, then the fact check link took on, the conversation under the fact check link was largely about how to discredit the fact check link. Mm-hmm. Was go downvote this, a doctor on YouTube, Dr. Mike, made a great video. Everybody needs to go brigade the comments and downvote the video to ensure that the recommendation engine doesn't amplify it, right? So there are battles for attention, recognizing that unfortunately right now, a lot of information, what we see is so much determined by how many likes it's gotten, how many shares it's gotten. It's like this consensus of the most liked. If many people have liked it, therefore it's a thing that the rest of us should pay attention to or treat as true. That's the thing we need to be getting away from. We need to have a better understanding of how to curate and surface information that isn't entirely predicated on engagement. And that, I think, is like one of the main challenges for the platforms in the next few years.
And I think the other thing that come out of that, which is so interesting, is the fact that people are knowing how to game the system. They're understanding how this works, and they're understanding the impact they can have. We've only got 5 minutes left. I'm going to just read a very quick quote from Marina Gorbis, writing for Medium this week, who says that, very topically, in order for us to safeguard a healthy body politic, our cognitive immune system needs an upgrade. She goes on to say that if we limit that upgrade to technological solutions, then we're going to fail, and that we need to set it in the whole societal context that we've been talking about. So what I'd love to do, just to end with, is to start with you, Camille, and just give us some of your hopes and your thoughts about how we might move forward with this and the sort of positive interventions we might make. And I'll come to you, Renee, and you, Claire, with the same question to wrap up. Camille.
I actually have a pretty optimistic view of the situation, and perhaps it's because I've been working on these issues for a few years. I remember what it was like on the other side of 2016, where disinformation was a little bit of a taboo. There was more often than not no specific rules that anybody had for what to do with it. It wasn't a structured discussion. There wasn't a field of study and a field of practice. I do think that we've come a really long way. I think that the platforms are being more straightforward about how they're going to tackle these issues. We've created more transparency. There's a robust field of researchers and practitioners that are, holding up the standard for this is what real transparency looks like. This is how you detail a campaign. This is how you attribute it. So there's a lot that we still have to do. As Claire said, it's very much a cat and mouse chase between the disinformation actors and the community of people who are working on this topic. But I think that we're in a much, much better place than when we were a few years back.
That's great. I love the positive note that we're starting to edge towards finishing on. Claire?
It's a mixed bag, because I think on one hand, the scale of the problem has meant that there are now many, many people having these conversations around dinner tables in a way that, as Camille said, it was a pretty nerdy niche subject 4 years ago. So I think there's more awareness generally in society. I think there's more of an understanding that people themselves have to take responsibility and help their own communities learn not to share this kind of information. But I think if we'd had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have been a little bit more optimistic, because I felt around health misinformation, we kind of had an agreement. Watching what's playing out right now online around the protests in response to systematic racism has reminded me of what it looks like when we have political speech and the complexities of that. So we've still got a long way to go. Yes, it's great people are considering it, but we're not out of the woods yet.
Thanks, Claire. Renee, where are you on this?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Probably between Claire and look, I think, again, I remember in 2015, when, like I said, when I was an activist screaming about the anti-vaccine movement and their remarkable ability to have the recommendation engine to just push their content to people who'd never solicited it. feeling like Chicken Little almost, like saying like, am I the only person concerned about this? And I feel that the intense of the public, lawmakers, civil society, academia, the platforms themselves, we've really built extraordinary networks prioritizing the problem of, as Claire has called it, information disorder, a range of different spectrums. So that gives me hope. But I will say also, it is an arms race. And the one that I have is that, in the US, we have an election coming up, a very, very high stakes election, one likely to, I hesitate to say be disputed in the real sense of the word, but in the, there are a lot of things that are riding on people believing that that election goes through and is undisturbed by either foreign interference or domestic manipulation. And so I think that those stakes are so key, and I am very, very concerned about how that continues to play out and what that means. How that the success or failure of us believing that our election was legitimate shapes the world in the next 5 years.
So what a great note to end on, because we are going to be looking forward to that. It's going to be a huge focus for us all. I just want to say thank you so much. I appreciate how busy you all are at this time, given the subject matter that you're working on. And I thought that was a really wonderful, far-reaching and incredibly intelligent debate. So thank you so much. It's really appreciated. I know by the audience, I'm seeing questions and comments come in, and by all of us who've been taking part. So thank you, Camille. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Renee. I think we're signing off. Good evening.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.